Today I've got some good news and some bad news, or should I say some good bishops and some bad bishops. Now if you'll remember, we already talked about knight versus bishop many moons ago, but today we're just going to focus on when you've got a good bishop and your opponent has a bad one. Now recall the position in front of us. We've actually talked about this. In this position, let's first identify what are the bad bishops. Now most of white's pawns are on light squares. That means white's light squared bishop is generally his bad bishop, or at least his worst bishop. Now for black, it's clearly his dark squared bishop because it's being blocked in. Generally, if you get down to the end of the game and your final piece is your bad bishop, that is not a good thing. Recall in this position, it's a big mistake for black to play the move f4 because then white can squeak out his bad bishop with bishop to g4 and white will be able to trade it off for a knight or a bishop. So a much better move, we've already been over this, is to play the move knight to f6 that guards the g4 square. And now black can play f4 and expand on the king's side later on. Let's take a look at a little bit more of a practical example. In this position, clearly white has the bad bishop. All of his pawns pretty much are on light squares. Now, here's one rule you can use. If your opponent has the bad bishop, you want to trade, and trade some more. What that's going to do is that's going to leave your opponent with his only remaining piece being the bad bishop, and that makes for a much weaker position. So let's take a look at what the Grandmaster playing black played here. He first plopped his knight into the outpost, which pretty much forced white to capture it. That knight is too strong. And then black captured this way. That gets all of these pieces on the f-file off the board. Bunch of captures just happened, and now white only has 2 pieces left, or really, it's like 1.5 pieces, because this guy is really not doing much. From here, black decides to invade with his rook, and watch how black forces the rooks off the board. Rook to c3. White, again, pretty much has to capture, because if the rook moves back, black's rook will move over to the square e3, and you can see part of the problem of the bad bishop. Not only is this bishop blocked by its own pawns, but the enemy gets to attack the pawns because they're on the same color. So this pawn is weak, this pawn is weak, this pawn is weak. I don't see a way for white to save all of those pawns. So if we back up, white decided he had to trade, and now it's just a matter of activating the king. Let's see who wins the race to activate the kings. The black king comes all the way around, and he makes it to the square b4. Now white does hold for the moment. Now it's just a matter of black's bishop sneaking into white's camp, and eventually he will be able to target and win some pawns. So bishop to h3, bishop to g2 is coming next, so white stops that with bishop f3, but then the bishop goes to the square f1. Now you might be thinking, is this bishop going to sacrifice? Well, kind of, but not on c4. White plays a waiting move, bishop h1, and look at this really cool winning move. Bishop to d3 check, and white resigned because when he takes the bishop, king takes. Notice there's only one remaining light square stopping the pawn from promoting, and clearly this bishop is in no position to be able to get there. So black went on to win. You might think that this is pretty easy stuff, but would you believe that the 13th world champion of chess, that's right, Mr. Garry Kasparov, didn't know fully how to use his better bishop? Maybe we should get him a ChessKid account. What do you think? Of course, I'm kidding. He is 100 times the player than Funmaster Mike will ever be, but take a look at this position that he just got into recently. Now, he is down a pawn, but he has the better bishop. All of black's meaningful pawns are on light squares, the same color as the bishop. That means white will be able to target those pawns, but it also means black's pawns will get in the way of his own bishop. Now you might be wondering, Funmaster Mike, what about these pawns? They're on white squares. That's true, but that's the same side of the board that Kasparov's king is on. All those pawns are guarded. Now, what was the winning move for Kasparov? Maybe you've already spotted it. White to move and win. If you don't know, pause your video, see if you can figure it out. If you're back, that means you found bishop to h5. What a cool move. If the bishop gets captured by pawn takes, then g6 forces a queen. Because even if the king runs to e7, we take, and there's no way to stop the pawn. Notice how black's bishop is blocked by his own pawns from getting back to be able to guard the h7 square. Now, if you don't take the bishop, you might want to rush in with your king, but now I'll just sacrifice. Again, if you take, I force the queen, and if you play king f8, I'll just take a second pawn, and this g6 pawn is going places, pretty hard to stop the promotion. Kasparov would have won the game here with his better bishop. Now, let's take a look at this example where, again, white has the better bishop. Every single one of white's pawns is on the opposite color of the bishop, but black's bishop is stuck by his own pawns, and all white has to do is sort of get his bishop in behind the pawns. So watch how white started out here. With a pawn sacrifice. Yes, that's right. Because after takes and the bishop moves back, then the king moves in, and we're going to get that pawn right back. We're going to have ourselves an outside pass pawn. Black really can't afford to trade bishops here because the outside pass pawn is going to get to the other side. So Black's bishop had to run away, but look what happens now. That's right, White's bishop sneaks in and targets all of Black's pawns. Now Black got a little bit of counterplay by invading with his king, but if I just make a few more moves, we're just going to stop here and say White went on to win because he's got this outside pass pawn. And even if the bishop runs over to stop it, then this outside pass pawn on the clear other side of the board would win the game. One more fun example, just because it's a little bit different than what we've looked at before. This super famous example, White has a really horrible bishop. But I just want to show you, sometimes you can activate your bad bishop and make him go from 0 to hero. In this position, White's bishop, seemingly without any useful squares, made a brilliant sacrifice to remove the blockade. And after the queen took, then another sacrifice. That opens up the king. 2 minor pieces sacrifice in 2 consecutive turns. But watch what happens after takes. Check. We take the knight. Now you better not go this way, because I'll play queen f7, queen d7 mate. So the king went the other way, but now White just plays e7, and there's too many threats. We're threatening queen f8 mate. We're also threatening to promote and give mate. Black does give some checks, but all White had to do here was find a clever way to hide the king, which he did after takes. The king ran away, we block with the pawn, and finally the checks were over. So the activation of the bishop won that game for White. To review, if you get down to the end of a game and you have the better bishop, use your bishop to target your enemy pawns. And if your opponent has the worst bishop in the middle game, you want to trade some more and try to get down into a true bishop ending where I think your powerful bishop will win the day.